I'm Charlotte. I grew up in that house from the time I was 9 until I moved out in my early 20s. It wasn't the kind of place people would describe as creepy, at least not out loud. It was an older, two-story home. My dad bought the house not long after he got a promotion that required us to relocate. We didn't have family nearby, and my parents wanted something stable, somewhere we wouldn't have to move again. The house had good bones, according to my dad. Solid frame, wide rooms, and a long hallway upstairs that connected all the bedrooms. It had been owned by an older couple before us, and as far as I knew, they'd lived there for decades. Growing up, the house was just normal. Loud when it needed to be, quiet when everyone was asleep. Floors creaked, doors stuck in the humidity, and the plumbing made sounds you learned to ignore. My parents raised 3 kids there. Holidays were crowded. Summers were noisy. My mom kept the place meticulously clean, the kind of person who wiped counters twice and vacuumed in straight lines. My dad handled repairs himself, even when he probably should have called someone. There was no story attached to the house, no local rumor, no warning from neighbors. If you asked me back then whether the place felt strange, I would have said no without hesitation. The first thing that made me look at it differently didn't happen while we lived there. It happened years later, after everyone had mostly moved on. It was during the holidays, one of those years when everyone was home at the same time. My parents had asked me to help digitize old home videos, VHS tapes that had been sitting in boxes for years. Birthdays, school plays, random weekends where my dad just kept the camera running too long. I set everything up in the living room of their new place, converting tapes one by one while everyone went about their day. At first, it was boring in the way old family footage usually is. Kids mugging for the camera, my mom telling us to stand still, my dad laughing behind the lens. The house looked smaller than I remembered, like it always does when you see childhood places later. I noticed something in the background of one clip, a shape near the far end of the hallway, barely catching the light. It looked like a shadow, darker than the rest of the hallway, shaped like a person standing still. I rewound the tape and watched again. Same thing. I assumed it was one of us, maybe my brother stepping out of frame, but the clip didn't match that explanation. The camera angle stayed steady, and no one ever walked through that space. I shrugged it off and kept going, but it showed up again. Different tape, different year. Same hallway, same shape, always in the background, never centered, never acknowledged. Sometimes it was near the staircase, sometimes closer to the bathroom door. Always upright, always still. I called my sister over and pointed it out. She leaned in, squinted, and laughed a little. "That's just a shadow," she said. "Probably Dad moving around." I showed my parents. My mom barely looked before dismissing it. My dad said it was the way the light hit the wall. Nobody reacted the way I expected them to, and that reaction, or lack of it, made me feel foolish for bringing it up. I stopped mentioning it. A few months later, circumstances lined up in a way that brought me back to that house. My parents were in the middle of helping my aunt after a medical issue, staying with her for a while. I needed somewhere to stay temporarily while I looked for an apartment closer to work. The old house was empty, still owned by my parents, waiting to be sold eventually. It made sense for me to stay there. It was familiar. I knew the layout better than anywhere else. And I didn't feel afraid of it, at least not consciously. The first week, I slept in my old bedroom, unpacked a few boxes, and settled into a quiet routine. The neighborhood hadn't changed much. Same neighbors, same sounds at night. I spent most days out job hunting or working remotely, coming home in the evenings to a house that felt oddly preserved in time. The quiet was noticeable, but not unsettling, just different from when the place had been full. It was toward the end of the second week. I was upstairs folding laundry when I heard it from somewhere below. It was a dry cough, short and restrained, like someone trying not to be loud. I assumed it was coming from outside at first, maybe a neighbor in their yard, but it was closer, inside the house. I stood still and listened. Nothing followed. The coughing came back the next night. This time I was in the kitchen, rinsing dishes. It sounded like it was coming from the hallway, just out of sight. Again, it stopped as soon as I focused on it. I didn't search the house. I didn't feel panicked, just uneasy in a way I couldn't quite define. A few days later, I was walking down the upstairs hallway, heading toward the bathroom, when I heard someone say, clearly and calmly, "I'm bleeding." It sounded like someone speaking normally from another room. I stopped in the middle of the hallway. The house was empty. I knew it was. I hadn't heard a door open or close. I hadn't heard footsteps. The voice didn't sound like it was coming from outside. It was inside the house, close enough that I could place it spatially, but not close enough to pinpoint. I checked every room. Doors were locked, windows were shut, no signs of anyone else being there. That night, I slept with the lights on. The next day, I called my mom. I didn't dramatize it. I told her what I'd heard and said I didn't feel comfortable staying there much longer. She told me to come stay with them, but they were still at my aunt's place and space was limited. We agreed I'd come over in the morning. That night was the worst one. I was sitting in the living room early evening, trying to distract myself. I heard something in the hallway, not footsteps, but like the sound of something shifting, like fabric brushing against the wall. I looked up just in time to see something past the opening of the hallway. It wasn't solid. It wasn't transparent either. It looked like a person-shaped absence, darker than the surrounding space, moving with intent. It paused, then it lifted what looked like an arm and waved. The kitchen door swung open immediately after, hard enough to hit the wall. That was the moment I locked every door I could reach, grabbed my keys, and left the house. I didn't sleep there again. I've tried, over the years, to find a rational explanation for what happened. Shadows can look like anything if you stare long enough, but the videos still exist, the figure is still there, and I know what I saw. My parents sold the house not long after. I never asked them whether anything strange had happened there before we moved in. I'm not sure I want to know. I don't say the house was haunted as a statement of fact. I don't know what was there. I only know that something in that house was present long before I noticed it. I grew up and spent most of my early 20s in a town that most people only ever passed through. It sat along a state highway, the kind of place where you knew the sound of freight trains better than traffic, and where the weather dictated the mood more than anything else. Winters were long, summers dragged, hot and dusty. Nothing ever really happened there, and people took pride in that. My parents still lived there. My dad worked for the school district, and my mom cleaned houses for a few of the older families on the edge of town. We weren't poor, but we watched our spending. Everyone did. When I graduated high school, I stuck around longer than I planned to. College didn't work out the first time, and jobs were limited unless you wanted to commute an hour each way. That's how I ended up delivering pizzas. The pizza place was one of 3 restaurants in town that stayed open past 9. It sat in a small strip mall next to a laundromat and a tax service office that was closed most of the year. We mostly served the same customers over and over, families on Fridays, bored teenagers, truckers passing through, and the late-night order from someone working a night shift at the factory outside town. Delivery wasn't glamorous, but it paid decently once tips were factored in. I worked evenings, usually from 4 until close. On weeknights, closing meant midnight. On weekends, sometimes later. By then, the roads were empty, and the town felt bigger than it actually was. I knew every street by memory, which houses had dogs, which driveways were steep, which trailers had broken porch lights. I could tell you which customers paid in exact change and which ones always tried to short you $1. Nothing about the job surprised me anymore, until that night. It was fall. Not quite winter, but your breath showed when you stepped outside. The store was slow. We'd had a rush around dinner, then nothing for almost an hour. I was restocking soda in the cooler when the order came in. It wasn't online. It was a phone order, which was already unusual by then. Most people used the website, even in our town. I remember the cashier calling out the address and pausing halfway through it. "Hey," she said, leaning toward the screen. "Is this a real street?" I walked over and looked. The address wasn't familiar, but that wasn't unheard of. Some of the rural roads outside town had names that never stuck in my head. "What's the cross street?" I asked. She shrugged. "They didn't say, just gave the address." I pulled my phone out and typed it into Google Maps. Nothing came up. I tried variations: road, lane, drive. Still nothing. Probably new construction, I said, though even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. New construction in that town was rare, and when it happened, everyone knew about it. The manager overheard us and came over. He looked at the screen, frowned, then waved it off. "Call them back and confirm," he said. The cashier did. She came back a minute later and said they confirmed the address and gave directions instead. It was off one of the county roads, a few miles past the edge of town. The order wasn't big. One large pizza, paid in cash, nothing else. I took it. Once you passed the last row of houses, the streetlights disappeared. The road narrowed, lined with fields that had already been harvested, leaving dark, uneven ground stretching out on both sides. Every now and then you'd pass an old farmhouse or a trailer set far back from the road. I followed the directions exactly. I found the driveway easily enough. It cut through a line of trees and curved slightly before opening up to a clearing. The house sat farther back than most, an older two-story place with boards nailed over several windows. That alone wasn't unusual. There were plenty of abandoned or half-abandoned houses like that outside town. What caught my attention was the light. There was a single light on inside, visible through an unboarded window on the ground floor. I sat in my car for a moment, engine running, pizza bag on the passenger seat. I checked the address again. This was it. Maybe someone was fixing the place up, or maybe it was being used for storage. People did strange things with old properties. I grabbed the pizza and walked up to the door. The front door looked newer than the rest of the house, solid wood with a fresh coat of paint. I knocked. I heard movement inside. Footsteps. A pause. The door opened. The man who answered was tall and thin. He was clean-shaven, with short hair that was graying at the temples. He wore jeans and a plain long-sleeve shirt. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Pizza?" he asked. I nodded and told him the total. He handed me cash, exact change, no tip. That didn't bother me. Plenty of people didn't tip. As I handed him the pizza, he looked past me toward my car. "You deliver out here often?" he asked. "Sometimes," I said. "Depends on the order." He nodded like he was thinking something over. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded bill, separate from the payment. "You want to earn a little extra money?" he asked. I hesitated. "Doing what?" "Just another delivery," he said. "Real simple." He reached behind him and brought out a small white package wrapped tightly in plastic. It wasn't very big, maybe the size of a paperback book. I didn't touch it. "No, that's okay," I said. "I should get back." He held the package out anyway, closer this time. "It's easy," he said. "Pays better than pizza." Something about the way he said it, it was creepy. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't aggressive, it was casual, like he was offering me a soda. "I'm good," I said, stepping back. "Thanks, though." For a moment, he just stood there, holding the package, looking at me. His smile faded, and then I heard a woman scream. It came from inside the house, somewhere deeper in, muffled. It was sharp, full of panic. The man's head snapped toward the sound. His expression changed instantly. The door slammed shut, and I heard the lock slide into place. I stood there, frozen, pizza smell still clinging to my jacket, staring at the door. I didn't knock again. I didn't call out. I walked back to my car as quickly as I could without running, got in, and drove. I didn't go back to the store right away. I pulled over once I was back on the main road and sat there, hands shaking on the steering wheel. I replayed the sound of that scream over and over in my head, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. I hadn't. I called the police from my car. I told them exactly what happened, gave them the address as best I could, and described the house and the man. The next morning, the town was buzzing. The police had found multiple women inside the house. They were alive, shaken but alive. The man had tried to flee and was arrested not far from the property. Details were scarce at first. The police didn't release much information, and the local paper was cautious about what it printed. Rumors spread anyway. People talked about kidnapping, trafficking, stuff. Some said the house had been under investigation for months. Others claimed no one knew it was occupied at all. I moved away a few years later, went back to school, got a job in another state, built a different life. I never found out exactly what that man was doing, and sometimes the most important thing you can do is walk away. When this happened, I was living alone in a rental house. It wasn't a bad area, just quiet and a little forgotten. Most of the houses had been built decades earlier, and a lot of the people who originally lived there had either moved on or passed away. New renters like me came and went, but the place never felt lively. I worked a standard office job at the time. I didn't socialize much outside of work. By the time all this happened, my work had become my comfort. Nothing unexpected ever seemed to happen there, and I liked it that way. My house sat near the end of a short, dead-end street. There was a wooded area behind it, just a strip of trees and overgrowth separating the neighborhood from an old drainage easement the city barely maintained. Most people didn't go back there. It wasn't dangerous, just ignored. Inside, the house was simple. One floor, 2 bedrooms, thin walls. You could hear when someone walked past outside or when a car turned onto the street. At night, it got very quiet. No nightlife noise, no trains, no nearby highway. A few weeks before everything happened, there had been an issue at work involving a coworker. He wasn't on my team, but he was around enough that everyone knew who he was. He had a habit of hovering, standing too close, remembering details people hadn't meant to share. It made people uncomfortable. But for a long time, it stayed just on the edge of what could be reported. Eventually, it crossed that line. Several coworkers went to HR about him following them after work, showing up in places they hadn't told him about, sending messages that were technically harmless but clearly unwanted. Management investigated, and he was fired. The day it happened, he didn't take it quietly. Security had to walk him out. As he passed desks, he muttered things about betrayal, about how everyone thought they were safe. At the time, most of us dismissed it as someone lashing out because they'd lost their job. I didn't think about him much after that. About a week later, I got a phone call late one evening. The number wasn't saved, and I didn't recognize the area code. I answered out of habit. No one spoke. There was no background noise, no breathing. After a few seconds, I said hello. Nothing. I hung up and forgot about it. Then it happened again the next night. Same number, same silence. It was a scam call or some automated system glitching out. But something about it bothered me. I started keeping my phone on the table instead of in my pocket, like I was expecting it to ring. A few nights later, after I'd already gone to bed, I heard a knock at my front door. It was late enough that I knew it wasn't a neighbor. I checked the time first. Just after 10, the knock came again. I looked through the peephole. It was him, the same coworker who'd been fired. For a moment, I genuinely thought I was mistaken. My brain tried to reject it, but the longer I looked, the more obvious it became. Same face, same posture, same unsettling stillness I remembered from work. I hadn't told anyone where I lived. We hadn't been friends. There was no normal reason for him to be standing on my porch. I didn't open the door. I asked what he wanted. He smiled when he heard my voice and said my name, slowly, like he was savoring it. I told him he needed to leave. I said he wasn't welcome and that I'd call the police if he didn't go. He started talking to himself, low, disjointed phrases that didn't quite make sense. He looked past the door, toward the street, then back at it, like he was distracted by thoughts I couldn't hear. When I told him again that I was calling the police, his expression changed. The smile dropped. He stepped back from the porch and walked toward the side of the house, disappearing from view. I locked every door and window and called the police anyway. I explained that someone I knew had shown up uninvited and refused to leave. They said they'd send a unit to check the area. While I waited, at one point, I saw him standing near the edge of my yard, partially obscured by the trees behind the house. He wasn't approaching. He was just there, watching. When the police arrived, he was gone. They searched the area briefly but didn't find him. The following evening, I tried to convince myself it was over. I kept the lights on, stayed in the living room, and avoided looking out the windows too much. Around midnight, there was another knock. This time, it wasn't patient. It was aggressive, hard enough to rattle the door. Before I could even reach my phone, the knocking turned into kicking. The door shook in its frame. I could hear him yelling now, his words slurred and angry. I called 911 and stayed on the line as he continued trying to force his way inside. At one point, I heard him move to a window, testing it. The police arrived. Their lights flooded the street. and I heard him run toward the back of the house. They caught him near the tree line behind my property. I learned he had outstanding warrants related to assault and stalking incidents involving other people. He'd been reported before, but nothing had stuck until now. I think about how easily he found me, how carefully he must have watched. There was nothing dramatic about what happened, no mystery to solve. The most frightening situations come from people you've already met.